Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Glad to see so many of you in the audience tonight. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. And I've had the pleasure of spending some time talking with tonight's guests, Matthew Pearl and Candice Millard, in the green room just now and earlier today. And you are in for a treat. They're both delightful and fascinating. Before I say anything else, it looks like we're having some trouble with the link for ordering a copy of The Taking of Jemima Boone. My colleague Jacques is working on that, so we'll keep at it until that link is working for you. And I apologize for that confusion. So we'll take care of it, and thank you for wanting to purchase the book. I'm not going to talk for too long because I know you're anxious to get started with the program, but I do have a little bit of housekeeping to do. First of all, you've discovered the chat. Please keep chatting away during the program. That's part of the fun of these virtual programs. And I always like to remind myself that it's kind of better in a way than a live event in person, because you're not allowed to talk when you're sitting in an auditorium listening to an author talk. So it's an added little bonus. So keep doing that. However, at the end of our program, and Matthew and Candice have agreed to take some audience questions. And to make that easier for us to manage, if you could, rather than put your questions in the chat, please put them down at the bottom of the screen where it says ask a question. And that'll make that so much smoother for us. Also, you can look at other people's questions. You can upvote them if you have the same question. So please help us out that way. And do ask questions. That's another part of the fun. While we're looking at that part of the screen, I'd like to draw your attention to that long greenish button. It says, your support is vital to the Mark Twain House and Museum. Please donate here. I'm very, very proud of the Mark Twain House and Museum and our staff for the way that we've gotten through the pandemic so far. We've stayed really connected with our communities. We've stayed very active. We've done as many as 3 or 4 of these virtual programs every week. So we've really been working hard. But while almost all of our virtual programs are free admission, they're not free for us to mount. And so there are all kinds of costs associated even with doing these virtual things. So if you're able, and I know it's not an easy time for anybody, but if you're able to share and spare anything, $5, $10, whatever you can share with us, I just want to guarantee you on behalf of the staff and board of trustees of the Mark Twain House and Museum, every single penny is very deeply appreciated and very much put to good use. So thank you in advance for any help you can offer. I'm going to stop talking in a moment and introduce our guests, but first I want to remind you that pretty soon we will have a link live for you to purchase tonight's book, The Taking of Jemima Boone by Matthew Pearl. And well, listen, we know you can get this elsewhere. We're no dummies. But if you do order through us, let me make that possible for you to do it, you'll get a signed copy. And you also have the benefit of knowing that your purchase supports the Mark Twain House and Museum. So again, thank you for that. So the time has come to introduce our guests. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsors. Tonight's program is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public WNPR. And it's produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord, who is our beloved trustee who passed away a little bit ago. And we're really glad to honor him in this way. So our guest tonight, Candice Millard, is the author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, The River of Doubt, Theodore Roosevelt's Darkest Journey, Destiny of the Republic, A Tale of Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President, James Garfield, and Hero of the Empire, The Boer War, A Daring Escape, and The Making of Winston Churchill. That book was named Amazon's #1 history book of 2016. Her work has also appeared in the New York Times Book Review, Washington Post Book World, The Guardian, National Geographic, and Time Magazine. And Candice is going to be in conversation tonight with Matthew Pearl, who's a writer of fiction and nonfiction. He's the co-founder of the digital magazine Truly Adventurous, and his nonfiction writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Atavist magazine, and Slate. His books have been international and New York Times bestsellers, translated into more than 30 languages. So I'm pretty impressed with both of our guests this evening, and I'm going to bring them up on screen right this moment. Take me just a second. Get you both here. And welcome, Matthew and Candice. So good to have you here tonight. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be
Thank
here.
you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
So Candice, later in the program, will you call me back up and I'll help out with the Q&A?
Yeah, sounds
All
great.
right.
All right.
Well, I'm going to sit back and enjoy with everybody else. See you in a little bit.
Okay. All right. Hi, Matthew. Thank you so much for this. I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and everything you want to tell us about your book. And I know everybody else's too. So it's a real honor to be talking to you tonight. So I wanted to start with just asking you what this book is about. What is the story at the heart of it?
Thank you, Candice. And thank you so much for doing this conversation with me. I'm particularly honored and intimidated because your books were among those that inspired me to take on this project, and maybe we'll be talking more about genres and writing in general, and I'll get to say some more about that. But yeah, this book came from my general interest in where books in our culture come from. So I'm always curious, and we see people explore this from time to time in kind of a specifically meta way, right? Where does The Great Gatsby come from, or where does Lolita come from, and sometimes finding that true story behind it and telling that story or stories. In this case, I became curious about The Last of the Mohicans, the James Fenimore Cooper novel. And found that one of the inspirations, there's never one, or usually there's not one monolithic kind of source or inspiration for a novel, but one of the inspirations was the kidnapping of Daniel Boone's daughter, Jemima. And that's what got me started digging into it. And the more I dug, and I'm sure you might find this too, Candice, when you explore a project, very often it seems like it could be really interesting, and then you just hit a wall, right? Where it feels like, oh, this is such a, in terms of true stories. Obviously, if we're talking about fiction, you can try to build yourself out of a premise that you get stuck on. But most of real life doesn't kind of keep building, right? In terms of stakes, in terms of suspense, what we call twists and turns, right? But so very often we explore projects that we say, okay, this can't be a book, right? Maybe it could be an article. Maybe it can't even be that. Maybe it's literally just, a sentence or two, and then it fizzles out. In this case, I became really excited because the more I looked into it, the more it built up. And I found that not only was this kind of initial event, the kidnapping of Jemima Boone and her two friends, really compelling in all kinds of ways, including the perspective of those doing the kidnapping, which was a group of Cherokee and Shawnee Indians, but that it started a chain reaction into a series of events. And what I really love as a reader and a writer, and I'm going to be presumptuous and think you do too, just from knowing your work, is finding a story that has a pretty tight scope. Right, as opposed to writing, okay, I'm going to write about 80 years of this person's life, or the 100 years of what happens in this particular place. I really like to find something where we can shape and craft it to feel like we have a beginning, middle, and end. And this, it felt to me, really lent itself that way over a 2.5-year period that included the kidnapping. It included another kidnapping. It included a kind of all-out battle and a trial. So once that kind of came together, I felt like, okay, I'm going to jump in and try this.
That's so exciting. Yeah, and you definitely have that. So in general, what would you say that you look for when you're choosing? And I know usually it's fiction, but when you're choosing a book idea, because I know, like you said, a lot of times you'll start out and think, oh, this has a lot of possibility, and you start looking into it and you think maybe it's not going to work. I mean, for me, that happens a lot more than the opposite.
Right.
So what are the things that you would say that you absolutely have to have in a book project? Specifically, let's say nonfiction, before you would commit to it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I think you are really a mastermind of, and probably your answer would be sharper than mine. I think one thing is relatability. Sometimes I think we feel something could be really interesting because the events themselves are interesting or how it unfolds is interesting. But if we really can't penetrate the people involved, if we can't relate, it doesn't mean they have to be perfect. And certainly, for example, Daniel Boone, I think, is a very relatable person. He's not a saint and he's not perfect, nor is any real person. But some people are really challenges to relate to, even if they're making choices we would consider, whatever their choices are, whether we consider them kind of worthy of admiration or we consider them kind of wrong-headed or even evil. We want to be able to at least understand why they're doing something. We want to find ways in which we can, I think, put ourselves in their shoes. One or more characters, I'll use that word, even though we're talking about real people in nonfiction. And I think that's, for me, that's part of what makes narrative nonfiction, right? Which is what, this is my first book-length narrative nonfiction, although I've done for years now, what we, in a funny way, we choose the word long form for it, but long form meaning not book length, right? But long article, and that was kind of where I tried out those skill sets that, again, I admire so much in your work of, does this have the raw materials that you need? And I mean, one thing I advise writers, including writers that I work with as an editor for the digital magazine that I edit, called Truly Adventurous, which Jennifer was kind enough to mention, is that you want to be able to kind of craft the shape. We sometimes readers or just people in general think, even writers think, that nonfiction falls out of the sky fully formed. Right. And in fact, I think there's an advantage to the source material. I try to use primary sources as much as possible, and there's an advantage to them being boring. If someone else has already shaped them in a way that's exciting, that might already exist. What you would want to create might already exist. So there's so much crafting and shaping, and for me, so much of that is, in addition to the relatability, the structure. Can you keep raising the stakes, right? If everything happens in the first 20 pages, that's kind of compelling and exciting, and then you're just explaining it, or you're just kind of unwrapping what happens to all those people, then you're losing so much of that energy and momentum.
Right. Yeah. So two things I wanted to follow up on, so don't let me forget. One is primary source material. I want to hear all about your research, and then the other is going back to structure and shaping. So let's maybe start with research. Where did you do the research for this book? Yeah,
in the case of this book, The Taking of Jemima Boone, it's set in Kentucky, and there's a couple interesting aspects of the time period. So it takes place in 1776, which, as we know, is an important year in all kinds of ways. And it actually happens, those first events, the kidnapping, happens July 14th, so about 10 days after the Declaration of Independence. Although, as I explained in the book, news travels slow back then. So actually the settlement in Kentucky that is kind of centered in the story, which is called Boonesboro, named after Daniel Boone in particular, but we can kind of expand it to the Boone family who were there and were contributing to the settlement. They just don't know yet about the Declaration of Independence, but certainly we're in the American Revolution. So literacy is still very inconsistent at the time for people, and so the sources are less in real time, being created in real time. There are a couple newspapers just cropping up, and those are wonderful sources. They tend to all have the same name as each other, which is the Gazette, which makes it hard when you research. Daniel Boone himself is literate, and he can write. We only have a few pieces of his actual handwritten writing. Within the years that follow, there are some biographers and interviewers who write and in some cases publish, in some cases in the first person, what Daniel Boone is saying.
Oh,
Separate issue as
nice.
you, now, then there's the issue of how accurate are some of these things. And I'm sure you run into this too. And of course, that's part of our job to deal with. I was very lucky that there are a couple people in the later 18th to the early 19th century who became obsessed with the frontier. And there's one gentleman whose name was Draper and one whose name was Shane, and they collected as much as they could. They corresponded with people who had lived through it, or the children or grandchildren of people who had lived in places like Boonesboro, and they collected it. They were not writers per se; they were more sort of collectors and connoisseurs, but an incredible contribution to those of us who examine that. And you know, I think one thing that my philosophy, and I wonder if it's something you share, is I don't want to make my reader do work, right? Mm-hmm. We're not writing in sort of an academic platform when we write narrative nonfiction. And so I feel like it's my responsibility to sort through, for instance, what's trustworthy, what's the most accurate possible renditions of the material from those primary sources that I try whenever possible to rely on. And there's certainly easy ways to flag potential questions for readers without kind of going down a rabbit hole and stopping your narrative and describing, well, it might be this and it might be that. And here are the reasons it might be this.
Right. That's what footnotes are for, right?
Exactly. And you know, even footnotes or endnotes in narrative nonfiction tend to be pretty concise these days, right? Because even that could expand your book and the footprint of your pages. So I think it's always a balancing act. I did get to also travel to Kentucky, and one of the wonderful things there is that even though Boonesboro, just to take that as an example, does not exist in its original form, an incredible recreation was built right near the site, and you could see the site where it was on the Kentucky River, but they couldn't build the recreation too close to the river without recreating what happened, which is constant flooding and problems with the river, right? So I that was a wonderful opportunity and a bonding experience. I brought my oldest son, who now is 11 and at the time must have been 8 or 9. Time blurs together for me, but you know, that's something else I think for our books that's behind the curtain. Each book isn't just about what it's about, but it's also a chapter in our own lives that when I imagine you might feel this too, when you look at your book, you're also seeing that.
Right. And were there things that you found that, to me, what's always interesting is finding things that you think might be in the book and might not, and end up you don't put them in the book directly, but still they do inform the book. Still, you're glad that you knew it, and it was important to your understanding of the story and the way that you are going to tell the story, and the story that you hope that the reader comes away from reading the book with.
That's such an interesting way of looking at it, and I don't think I ever thought of it so specifically that way, but I think that happens so much when we research, right? Because such a small fraction of what we do when we research these books ends up in an explicit way, right? On the page. But all of it goes into how you're seeing it, and I think you have to let yourself evolve also how you're seeing it when you're telling these stories. And you know, I think one thing in this case is that there were many, many distortions of the original events. And so I don't want to spend my real estate on, again, explaining to the reader what those distortions were, but they're fascinating because okay, why is this being distorted in this way? You know, one example is that, so part of the story is the rescue of Jemima and her friends. And in one distortion, there is the narrative that on the way home from being rescued, Jemima and Betsy and Fanny, the two other young women, get married to their rescuers. They kind of stop and they all get married.
Lovely.
Yeah, and it's clearly there's kind of a subtext of kind of centering the sort of male role in their lives, and that the first thing that has to happen is that they are paired off, right, with the heroes, right, when in fact they had all kinds of agency in really interesting ways, and that was part of what I felt my responsibility was in a story like this, which is so often told at the time or after, from that gaze of the kind of male storytellers. So what I felt my job was, in part, was, okay, how can I find what the young women were thinking? How can I find the tribal individuals, the warriors who were involved in this? What were their motivations? What were they going through? What were they grappling with? So that attempt to restore all the perspectives that in this case came together in really interesting ways with this event and this kind of chain reaction that followed it.
Right. So just getting back to your research a little bit, and you're able to go to Kentucky. Was most of your archival research then done online? Were there different archives that you're able to access? What was the archival research like?
Yeah, in this case, there isn't too much online. There's a fair amount that's luckily on microform or microfilm from those collectors. Unfortunately, it's not organized. I'm sure you've run into this too, right? Where there's a lot of material, but it's not particularly or really at all kind of organized. So it was a lot of going to libraries and just kind of staring, sometimes until you realize you don't know what you're looking at because you've been staring too long. Yeah, I think I even at one point looked into, can you buy a microfilm machine and order copies of these? And I don't remember the answer. I think you could in theory, but I think it would be very expensive, and I'm not sure that it would be worth doing. But but it is really, that's one of the things that can really stop you in your tracks with a nonfiction project, right? That especially one that's delving into history, is that there might be so many ingredients there, but if there's not sources to build a story off of, you sometimes have to throw up your hands. So I think on the one hand, it could be exhausting once you do find those very rich wells of sources. On the other hand, it's also necessary in order to be able to build what I hope this is doing and what you do so well, which is really narrative. How do we place the reader in an experiential story where it doesn't just feel like an overview. We're really providing the kind of color and the details and the very small moments that, to me, are more revealing and more effective than the broad strokes, the kind of bird's eye view that history can, in important ways, can also present itself as.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I always think that it's an essential truth in history. If you deprive history of emotion, of that color, of feeling like, okay, you're actually dropping into this different world and this different time, this different place. If you deprive it of that, I think it takes away an essential truth of history. If it's just, facts and dates and things, and it's just this dry kind of trudging through, you definitely lose something because you don't really experience it at all the way that the people who lived it did. So, and I think you absolutely captured that with this book. Absolutely. So along that line, let's talk about structure, and let's talk about how, I'm a big proponent of outlining. And I know I'm alone in that a lot of times. I know, especially for fiction, I read a lot of fiction, and you write excellent fiction. But I know, and I've heard a lot of fiction writers talk about they would never ever outline, that it would kill the story. And even a lot of nonfiction writers I know do not outline. I spend like a year outlining. So I'm really curious to see what your approach is to structure.
I think I tend to be more in your camp.
Yeah.
Which doesn't surprise me again because you were among my guiding lights for working on this. I think it really helps me to conceive of the story to have a structure in place. And in this case, I split the entire book up into 3 sections, sort of 3 overall sections, and then within the chapters within those. And I kind of had a pretty easy time in the case of this book with structure because it almost structured itself. Their lives were so eventful in this stretch of time, and one event often clearly led to the next one in ways that kind of felt like they had natural starting and stopping points for those sections, for those chapters. And again, as I mentioned, it kind of felt like they were building the stakes higher and higher. So so sometimes I think structure can be one of the most difficult challenges with nonfiction, and I think this goes back to the fact that it doesn't fall out of the sky. Sometimes it feels like it. Maybe we want readers to feel that it does, right? Because we don't want to make the reader make sense of have to work to make sense of, okay, how does this relate to this one, and even to the point, I don't know if you do this, Candice, and I'd be curious if you do, but even to the point where I'm very careful about, I don't even want to introduce names necessarily that are unnecessary, because I feel like our brains can start, well, wait a minute, do I already know that person? And we already, there's so many, again, I'll use the word characters because I'm not sure there's another word, although there maybe should be.
I do too.
Because it sort of sounds like it implies fiction. But I try to make sure that every character I'm spending time on is serving a role that we can follow and that doesn't end up confusing, and especially I think especially because names often repeat themselves, so we also I think have to deploy strategies, because again, we don't want, and that could be something as simple as also including, as I do in this book, including a chart of characters or family tree, or some guide in the front. It was interesting, and I think the books you've written probably presented some, because I know you've included them, some really nice illustrations or photographs to include to amplify the reader's experience. It was interesting in this one that really stumped me when my wonderful editor, Sarah Nelson at HarperCollins, touched base about whether we would have illustrations for this book. And I couldn't quite figure out why I was slow to sort of come up with a plan for it, because I think I was assuming we'd have it. And I realized that the illustrations, of course there were no photographs at the time, the illustrations and portraits and paintings that existed from that time or shortly after were really very cartoonish. They sort of simplified and caricatured both the settlers, the pioneers, and the Indians. And again, it doesn't mean they're not useful or important, but I realized that I didn't want to use the reader's energy on deciphering that, or my energy in explaining, okay, I'm going to show you this depiction of Jemima Boone getting kidnapped, but I'm going to explain how she's, the Indian figures are presented as the dark others, the intruders, and Jemima is presented in this angelic light. And I realized that would do exactly the opposite of what you and I just talked about, which is to kind of put the reader in that experience of what I'm doing my best to recreate of what it was actually like, as opposed to a very deliberately kind of slanted agenda in depicting it, or just an agenda that was rooted in a very specific moment in time. So that was an example where I chose to leave material out that I, at first I thought might be helpful for the reader.
Right, right. What were some of the things that you found either while you're doing research or while you were writing the book?
Yeah, I kept finding really fascinating elements, some of which I ended up really sort of embracing and throwing my arms around and making space in the book. And sometimes that's a surprising process because you might think you're going to focus in one way and then you end up either expanding or changing
Right.
what your focus might be. So one example of a part of the book that I didn't expect would be in it was an American Indian woman named Non-Helema. She also had a Christianized name of Kate that was given to her by a missionary. The missionaries, by the way, were among those who really chronicled Indian life because they were traveling through tribal towns. And it's one of the challenges of the research. We talked a bit about the research is that tribes themselves were not steeped in a document-based culture of preserving history that way. It's very different. So as a writer and a storyteller, you also have to take different approaches to recreating that. And Non-Helema was a warrior herself. She was said to be over 6 feet tall and fight in several battles. And she became the confidant of one of the American officers who was in charge of one of the bases in the frontier. And his name was Matthew Arbuckle. And it's just a fascinating relationship. It's not center stage in the book, but it's certainly on stage, where Arbuckle sees himself, for the most part, as very much a fighter against the Indian tribes. But he has a platonic but very trusted relationship with Non-Helema, and she ends up essentially divesting herself of her Indian life, of being part of the Indian community and living on the fort. And it was really a fascinating example of something that kept surprising me in all kinds of ways, which was how fluid the boundaries were between the communities and the culture. I think many of us grow up thinking these are completely diametrically opposed spaces that existed, particularly in the frontier in sort of its most dramatic fashion, because of clashes exemplified by the kidnapping, in which we see kind of violence coming to the surface. But in fact, these very much were shared spaces, were cultures that bled into each other. Many of Daniel Boone's kind of iconic frontier skills were coming from and being drawn from the tribes. I mentioned a second kidnapping, and that's when Daniel Boone himself is kidnapped. And we are kind of in a position of thinking that there's vengeance involved because Daniel Boone has killed, in rescuing Jemima, has killed the son of an important war chief of the Shawnee. In fact, Daniel Boone is made into part of that chief's family and is adopted in a ceremony to take the place of that son. So in all kinds of ways, family and community are blurring those lines between the tribal communities and the settlers' communities. And I think in thinking about surprises and kind of fascinating elements, that would be right at the top of my list.
Right. So I think that a lot of people here tonight and a lot of people who will come to this book will come to the book because they're interested in the subject, but I think a lot of them will come to it because of you and because of what they've read from you in the past. So what's very interesting to me, especially as someone who has never written fiction and thinks I would be terrible at it, the difference between writing fiction and nonfiction. And for you, what are some of the similarities besides the obvious ones? What are some of the differences? What were some of the challenges? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So this is somehow my 7th book, but
Wow.
the 6 previous. Oh, thank you. I think I don't. Sometimes sometimes I don't know if that's an accomplishment or a reflection of some kind of instability. But you know, I mentioned that it's been a couple of years in which I kept deepening my experience in writing nonfiction, and particularly the type of nonfiction that I was drawn right to was narrative nonfiction. I think that very much relates to coming out of fiction, because I think some of the best narrative nonfiction, I wouldn't be dogmatic about it, but I think some of the best, and I would absolutely include your books in this category, read like fiction, right? We experience it as a reader in the way that we experience a novel. And again, that gets back to characters coming alive. It gets back to the structure providing us enough suspense that we need to keep reading, right? A lot of new writers to narrative nonfiction, I notice, as an editor, want to tell us everything that's going to happen before it happens. Right. I always say, well, don't tell us before it happens, right? Because in their minds it's already happened. So the sort of natural way to do it is to say, okay, this is what I'm going to tell you about what happened, and now I'm going to tell you. But we really want to be in the moment, just like we would be in a novel. All that said, it certainly was intimidating, and it was sort of a gradual process for me to feel like I was ready to try a book-length work of narrative nonfiction, which of course is a different type of project than a shorter one. I think for me, sort of my surroundings were becoming more saturated with nonfiction. I started editing the magazine that I mentioned, Truly Adventurous, the digital magazine, which is devoted to narrative nonfiction, to long form. My wife actually wrote her first book, which is also narrative nonfiction, and was inspired by a member of her family. We'll show it here, which is called Terror to the Wicked, which I'm so proud of. That came out, I think, last year from Knopf. Also intersecting with American Indians, with one of the first murder trials in the country. So I think as it surrounded me more, and I've always had friends who were terrific writers of narrative nonfiction, I finally worked up the courage to talk to my agent, who is also your agent, Suzanne Gluck, who is just a wonderful advisor on everything. Yes, absolutely. And the title of my book, Taking of Jemima Boone, was actually her idea.
Great one.
Yeah, oh, thank you. Well, no, I shouldn't say thank you because I can't take credit for it, but I agree.
And it's a great cover, by the way. I love the cover.
Oh, thank you. And I also can't take credit for that, but I agree. And they did a wonderful job with the design. And, you know, the first thing I did was kind of pull out a couple books, including River of Doubt, including In the Heart of the Sea by Nathaniel Philbrick.
Love that book.
You know, books by Stacy Schiff, by Simon Winchester. There's a handful of writers who I feel like really, without exaggeration, have changed the way we write and we read narrative nonfiction over the last 10 or so years, in ways that I'm just so impressed by and made me want to do this. And one of the first things I did, and not kidding you, was to chart out how you structured River of Doubt. And sort of how you were able to draw the reader in immediately and to sort of keep us hooked on that story. And that, you know, got me writing the proposal. And from there, I was lucky to find for Suzanne and then Sarah at HarperCollins to support it. In terms of the differences, you know, the fiction I've written has been what I call research-based fiction. You know, sometimes we call it historical fiction. Historical fiction is such a weird term because
I think
there's
so
no real definition for it, right?
Right.
Like if we write a novel set in the 1980s, I think we don't tend to call that historical fiction. Maybe wrong for that, right? Yeah. But it's for better or worse, that's quite a while ago now. the 1980s. So I don't know. I don't know where the line gets drawn. What feels like historical fiction. But it's, I've always done a lot of research for my fiction, and it's always been really important to me that the fiction I write is authentic to the history. But here's the secret. I don't know that anyone cares about that. It took me a while to realize that. Sometimes I would actually find things that had never been published before. Out the particular history. So let's say about Edgar Allan Poe. One of my novels deals with his death, and I would integrate it into my novel, and I'd be so excited about it. And of course, nobody cared, because how could they tell the difference? You're not,
you don't know
unless you're reading avant-garde fiction. There's no endnotes. There's no So it's purposefully blending fact and fiction in a way that is not meant to be able to, for you as a reader, to be able to separate. So that was kind of a starting point for a frustration where I felt, I really, there's these great true stories. One of my rules of thumb that I've developed is that if something can be told in nonfiction, go for it. Meaning there are stories that you can't tell in nonfiction. It's sort of going back to what started, right? Is that there might be an incredible thing that really happened.
Right.
There's a series of things. There simply isn't the material. There's not what we might call the reporting, right? Whether it's
heartbreaking, but
exactly right. So that might be the perfect subject for whether it's a historical fiction writer or some other kind of playwright, a screenwriter, some other kind of adaptation of that material. So for me, where I've landed is that if you can tell something with nonfiction, then that's a great place to start, because I do think there's an added power to be able to say, this is a true story, right? And it doesn't get lost in the, again, there's kind of that balance where people tend to feel that nonfiction just falls out of the sky, which it doesn't. But once you do it right, it has this extra power to it. If you're able to craft it in a way that can really pull the reader in. So I have found for myself that nonfiction is less stressful. This is maybe the real answer.
I can see that. No, I would think so.
And I don't know how you are in general. I'm not a decisive person. I have trouble with, like at a restaurant, I'll have trouble with a menu. And I'm a vegetarian, so there's usually only even a few things. But even that, I will eventually order, right? And then I will just be kind of agonizing over whether I ordered the right thing. And then the people come and I'll look around. Maybe that was better. I really decisiveness is not one of my strengths. Maybe I have very few strengths, and that's certainly not one of them. So for not that there aren't a 1,000 decisions with nonfiction, of course there are, but it's not. For example, one thing that always plagued me with fiction is first person, third person, second person. I guess if you're being very experimental, there's not really an equivalent of that. For example, with nonfiction, it might be, okay, am I going to start the book or the article here or here? Probably the heres are fairly close together, right? That fine tuning is absolutely important. But it's not. I never felt, and maybe I haven't gotten there. You could tell me, having much more experience with nonfiction, I've never felt an existential crisis in writing nonfiction the way I have with fiction.
Right. Infinite possibility.
Exactly, right. I've never felt like, okay, I'm going to throw this out and start over, which I've not only felt but have done with fiction.
Yeah, no, that's really critical. Well, I would love to keep talking, and we will, but I think that, Jennifer, we should bring you on and start taking some questions. And I know that there'll be a lot of people who want to ask Matthew some questions.
Including me.
Yes.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you both so much. And, I wasn't necessarily expecting to learn so much about writing and writing process. It's been really, really fascinating. I'd like to hear a little bit more about this story. And, for instance, the clues that the girls managed to leave. Can you tell us a little bit and put that in context? And
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. And so again, there's 3 young women who are taken from the Kentucky River. So it's Jemima Boone and her 2 friends, Betsy and Fanny Callaway. And they are being taken away from that spot in the Kentucky River into the wilderness. So they all decide to try to find ways to leave clues for what they hope will be people that are looking for them, their family members and their fellow settlers from Boonesboro. So this was, absolutely one of those elements where I was looking for these tiny details that we might overlook if we're writing history at a bird's eye view. So Jemima ties 5 knots in a string from her clothes and drops it. Why does she do that? She's telling, she hopes, she's communicating how many kidnappers there are. And incredibly enough, Daniel Boone and his group find that, and Daniel Boone correctly interprets the meaning of that. Cool. So there's all kinds of ways that all of the people involved and their skills and including the members of the tribe are just astounding to me, and I think just to us in general from looking from our vantage point. They're also trying to dig their heels into the ground to leave marks. Their captors see this and sort of cut off the heels of their shoes.
Oh, wow.
Betsy Callaway has an engraved handkerchief. So she's ripping pieces of her name off. So literally kind of leaving a message in the dirt. They're breaking branches and leaves off. So those are some examples of and again, I try to surround the story, especially that part of the story, the kidnapping, with the perspectives of everyone involved, the rescuers, the young women, the tribal warriors who are being forced out of their land and are placed in this position of trying to gain leverage over the settlement, and really try to recreate what they're all thinking, what they're doing, and one of the kind of developments as they're being taken is that Jemima and the leader of the tribal party named Hanging Maw form a very important bond in which ultimately results in them trying to protect each other.
That is absolutely fascinating, and the story you just told it suggests perhaps a very special relationship between Daniel and Jemima Boone. It almost sounds like an apple that didn't fall too far from the tree. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. And I try to stay entirely in the narrative, and I think Candice, I noticed this about you as well. I don't step out or step back very much to kind of comment or go on detours. There's one place, Jennifer, where I do step out a little bit, which is to explain that there was a rumor that Jemima was not actually Daniel's daughter, and go into where that came from. But my conclusion to that is it makes it all the more interesting because the Boones apparently were aware of this rumor, that their bond was so close, that the truth is in the frontier that people very often didn't know their own birth years, because their records weren't being kept. They were traveling. So Jemima, we think, was 13 at the time, but we're not totally sure, just to give an example. So the fact that it would be confusing to some, who's someone paternity, what the paternity of a particular individual would be, how old they were. It's not actually surprising once you realize how kind of scattered their own knowledge of their lives were. But to me, it was actually more informative about how special their bond was, because they might have been unsure about her paternity. It's unclear, but if they were, they never wavered in how devoted they were to each other, and it comes not just in Daniel Boone's kind of dedication to finding Jemima when she disappears, but the reverse as well. When Daniel Boone is taken by the tribe that we mentioned, Jemima is the only member of the Boone family who stays behind, and everyone else assumes he's dead for good reason. The context clues are he's probably dead. Jemima is the only one who says, "I'm not leaving." The other Boones go back to North Carolina to be with Rebecca Boone, Jemima's mother's family. Jemima and her husband, she marries shortly after the rescue, stay behind, and it's in the face of adversaries, because the kind of people who take over Boonesboro are rivals to the Boones.
Ah, that is fascinating, isn't it, Candice?
Yeah,
It's
very
very amazing.
incredible. Yeah.
So a lot of people want to just know more about Daniel Boone. We've got people referencing the 1960s Fess Parker. Daniel Boone was a man. He was a real man. That's about all we know about him. And how do we not know that his daughter was kidnapped? And why is this not more a part of our national narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jennifer. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I often think how one of the common questions I get if I mention the book that I'm working on, or now that's published, is, oh, what's the difference between Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett? Many people say this. And I know nothing about. I watched a lot of reruns growing up. For some reason, those were not on like Nick at Night. That I'm familiar with all these shows that I probably shouldn't know anything about. But apparently, a reader told me this. They were played by the same people in the respective Disney series. In other words, Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone were played by the same actor. I actually have not looked up. I'm not an expert on these shows. I don't know if either of you.
Audience, chime in, please, and let us know what you know about that.
If anybody knows, but that's fascinating, because it helps explain, because I couldn't explain why. I mean, other than their names being vaguely similar, and they're not really in the same time period. Davy Crockett is in the early 19th century. And then dies at the Alamo in the 1830s. But in any case, one theory that I have of why so many people have forgotten the kidnapping of Jemima Boone, which was such a touchstone event for the frontier at the time, and then for those who kind of examined the frontier after, is the last of the Mohicans. I think sometimes when a literary work or adaptation is inspired by a true story, it almost replaces the true story in a strange way. Interestingly, to me at least, Jemima was still alive when The Last of the Mohicans was published. And it was very obvious to everyone that it was based on her life. Well, she wasn't literate. She was never taught to read. And as far as we can tell, we don't have any evidence that she learned to read later in life. She ended up in Missouri, and before she died, and this is very sad, she dictated her entire life into a manuscript. So she did get a chance to write her story, but it was lost in a boating accident. It was lost in the water. There was no copy of it. And the coda that I would add to that is that if you open Last of the Mohicans, any edition, you'll see a preface by James Fenimore Cooper saying what? He's warning women not to read it, that it's too disturbing or distressing for women to read the story. And it's just such an irony, such a twist for the story to be drawn from the experience of real women, and in particular this one very strong woman, Jemima Boone, to then be shut out on multiple levels. To not have the skills to read, to not have been given those skills to read, and then to be kind of pushed out of that experience, even if she were to be able to read, by a warning from the male author. So an interesting way in which the narrative, her true narrative, is dissolved, and I hope in some small way that this book can kind of push that true story back to the foreground.
Definitely.
It almost sounds like Jemima Boone warrants a biography of her own, outside of the narrative that you've shared in this book. That she sounds fascinating. How old was she when she died?
I'd have to refresh my memory on that, but I believe she was in her 70s, 60s or 70s. So I mean, a kind of perfectly normal lifespan for that point. She was also with Daniel Boone when he died. He died at her. I believe at her house, if I'm remembering that correctly. And he, according to accounts, he waited for her to be there and to hold his hand. He was clearly dying, and she was rushing home, or maybe it was at her brother's house. There were many siblings in the Boone family, some in the same area. So that also, just to sort of cap what you brought up, Jennifer, the sort of special bond between the father and daughter.
Wow. Some of our audience members are confirming that the same actor, and I believe it was Fess Parker. Yeah, Fess Parker played both. And I never put that together until this. I just did not put that together.
There you go. So that explains, at least in part,
this is why I love my job so much. So this is for both of you. This is from Kevin. He says, do either of you find visiting the locations that the characters in your books existed in helpful to providing the historical narrative? I guess your answer is going to be yes, but let's hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, Candice, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Yeah, it's hugely important to me. And like I said, sometimes, even if it doesn't explicitly end up in the book, it definitely adds to my understanding of the person and the time in which he or she lived. And being there, not just in their home, but like I wrote about Winston Churchill when he was captured during the Boer War, and being both where he was captured and where he was imprisoned. It still stands. It was a school at the time that the Boers used as a prisoner of war camp, and now it's a public library, and you can go in and you can go to the room where Churchill was kept. The trap door in the floor is still there, where they thought about tunneling their way out. There's still a map on the wall. That this was an officers' prison, so they were all highly trained cartographers, and they allowed them to draw a map of the war as it progressed, as they got news, and that's still up in the wall.
Wow.
I mean, I went to he hid for 3 days with these white rats in a coal mine shaft, and that the colliery is not there anymore, but the shaft is still there. Where he came out, the British consulate in Mozambique still there. So yeah, it's hugely important to understanding what these people experience and trying to express that. And just, somebody who I worked at National Geographic for so long. So to me, the little things that really brought the story to life, like I was curious, like what was it like for him in this coal mine shaft? I thought it would be tight and dark. But then I talked to people who had worked in these collieries for years, and they're like, actually, it's really large and it smells like pony feces, because they would put these poor ponies down there for weeks at a time to work. And so that, again, shaped how I was able to understand what Churchill endured and able to describe it. So yes, to me, it's both the best part, the most fun of the job, and I think, at least to me, both as a writer and a reader, the most effective way to then tell the story. Matthew?
Yeah, that's such a great insight, and I think for this particular book, because so little structurally exists from the 1770s in Kentucky. Right. It is a different experience, because some of what you do get to see is sort of recreations, but also even just seeing the settings. One place I visited with my son was the spot where the girls were taken by the tribe, and just standing there on the river and kind of imagining all of those different experiences happening at once. And I think one trick, and I don't know, Candice, how you handle this, is you only have so many resources for visits to somewhere that you don't live. If you live there, it's different, right? So it's tricky, because you don't want to go too early. If you go too early, you don't know all the things you're looking for, right?
Right.
And you can't go too late. You can't go after the book is written, because then it's already written. So it's sort of it's a challenge in the timeline of your process, right? Of Definitely. Okay, when is the perfect time that I'm going to invest both, sometimes financially, but also in terms of your work and your energy in taking that visit. And I do wonder, I mean, certainly it's affected me in some ways in terms of COVID and all the challenges with travel for that, how it will affect many writers with this kind of research, whether it's to go to an archives that might be closed, to go to a wonderful place like the Mark Twain House and Museum and
Right.
kind of take that, all of these things that if you're not living near it or if it's not open, can really alter the course or the timeline for a project.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, that was fascinating. Thank you. I just want to point out that our dear friend Ted Lange is in the audience tonight, and he says, Fess Parker signed a TV deal to do Davy Crockett for NBC TV, but Walt Disney would not release the rights, so they changed the character toAniel Boone. Thank you, Ted.
I should have written about the Daniel Boone Davy Crockett Disney battle. That sounds
you really should. Next time. So I'm not going to put you on the spot. Somebody is asking if you have a favorite Twain book, and I never put authors on the spot to talk about Mark Twain unless either of you has something compelling you'd like to say about that.
I mean, we have to be Huck Finn, I think, for me. Yeah. I just reread it actually a couple of years ago with my daughter. And I remember stopping at one point and saying to her, this is why it's a classic. This writing, you kind of forget. You think, oh, it's a story. It's the writing too. I mean, it's just so, just so many emotions, wrenching and funny and totally alive and original and only Mark Twain, and
right.
That's mine.
Yeah, I'm gonna totally get it wrong if I answer now. I'd have to think about it, but I do kind of enjoy the Camelot,
Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court.
That's quite right.
Which is my favorite Mark Twain book.
Oh, is it? Okay, so
really?
there you go. So
yes.
I got it right. Candice got it wrong. There's obviously no right or wrong because part of what makes him so interesting is that also his range, right? Is that he was, we tend to think of a lot of these writers like Twain in one way, but it's always interesting to remind ourselves, I think, of how much they experimented with different types of writing and whether it's in that case kind of historical fiction mixed in for Twain, and also kind of an allegory about, at least my memory of it is sort of an allegory of how we own ideas or kind of inventions and sort of that's in the mix too, which I always thought was interesting.
Those were amazing answers. I'm glad I did put you on the spot. I think, can you take one or two more questions, or we're kind of running toward the end of our program? And I will, somebody has asked if you're going to do a reading, Matthew, and we talked about this earlier. I think we're all looking forward to reading your book, but we've learned on these virtual programs that for authors to read out loud from their work just doesn't really work very well in the virtual platform. So I'm sorry to the reader who asked about that, or to the audience member, but I think that we're going to spare Matthew that experience to see.
And I would say even in person I get a little jittery to read out loud just because it's I always worry that you're going to be able to read it better than I can. So Candice and I chatted a little bit about that.
Yeah,
and that's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
So Marcus has a question. We were talking about Mark Twain, obviously, and Mark Twain got kind of more bitter as he grew older, and he had very good reason to do so. But Marcus wants to know, how true is it that Daniel Boone's reputation in becoming more antisocial as he grew older? Is that a thing that you know about?
That is fair. He was always a little bit on the antisocial side, I guess. I mean, not that word would have been applied at the time, but if we're sort of thinking about him from our perspective, that was part of why he was a frontiersman or a frontier leader, is that he was constantly pushing away from society and got disgruntled once wherever he was sort of became more populated. Mm-hmm. And eventually was fairly disgruntled with Kentucky and with the area that is center stage for this story. So he was always sort of removing himself. when in his older age, there was a boy who recounted seeing Daniel Boone on his porch and saying, aren't you Daniel Boone? And he said, I used to be. So this idea of sort of leaving behind sort of his public identity or public figure. But I do think that was kind of built into his personality always.
That's a great question.
And that's fascinating too, because Mark Twain was very conscious of having, his real name was Sam Clemens, and he was very conscious of having created this persona, Mark Twain. That's an interesting, I never knew I could be so interested in Daniel Boone.
There also, to also tie things together, there is this connection between Teddy Roosevelt that Candice, you've written about, and Daniel Boone, in that Roosevelt wrote a history of the West, the winning of the West, if I'm getting the title there right, and in it he talks about Daniel Boone, and Daniel Boone as kind of a representative of a certain time. So it was actually really helpful for me, because Roosevelt was really eloquent, and obviously not that Roosevelt has a completely three-dimensional view of history from our perspective, right? He's coming with his own biases, and but he definitely was interested in Boone as well.
Fascinating. So, a couple of things. I want to say that Jacques Lamar, my colleague, saved the day and was able to fix the book link. So I cannot imagine that you have listened to this conversation and not made a decision to buy this book. So the link, I think you can see it pretty easily in the chat right now. Please go ahead and click that link and purchase your signed copy. So one of the things I like to say is that the Mark Twain House is a writer's home and a home for writers. And I hope you both will consider yourselves members of that family of writers that we surround ourselves with at the Twain House. Has either of you been to visit the Mark Twain House in person?
My husband and daughter have. I'm very jealous. I have not had an opportunity, but I will.
Okay.
I plan on it.
Yeah,
I
think I almost visited. I think I was nearby and it was closed. It was my memory, is that it was not closed in general, just it wasn't the right hours, and I realized I was near it. So yes, I'll have to get back there as well.
Please do, both of you. And thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating. And I know our audience has lapped it up. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions. I kind of went with questions that aren't easily answered by reading the book. So if you have a burning question that would be answered by reading the book, you know what to do. Right? Thank you both so much. It's been a great
pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Candice, thank you so much.
My great pleasure. Take care. Good night.
And thanks, audience, for your great questions. We'll see you next time.